welcome to video 2 of our Cooking and Cooling Alternative Support for Appendix A and B mini video series. This video is brought to you by AAMP's Outreach. I'm Abbey Davidson, and I will be walking you through the requirements of Appendix A and B and alternate support for certain products. I'd like to extend a special thank you to Dr. Jonathan Campbell and Dr. Jeff Sindelar for their knowledge and time in aiding to put these presentations together. As I walk you through this presentation, if you have any questions, please make sure to write them down, and you can contact myself at abby@amp.com or Nelson Gatos, my outreach counterpart, at nelson@amp.com. The reason behind this mini video series is to aid processors in identifying and helping identify alternate support for their processes if it's needed, other than the 2021 Appendix A and B. We will walk through the requirements of Appendix A and B as it pertains to jerky products. We will also discuss alternate support options if the critical limits in Appendix A or B are not possible for your process to obtain. So, when processing jerky, relative humidity, as well as certain shelf-stable characteristics, may be hard to obtain for some small processors. Note, if product intended to be called jerky ends up not being shelf-stable, the product name needs to be called a different name, as a standard of identity with jerky is a shelf-stable meat or poultry product. Another note here, Salmonella is the indicator organism, or also called the target organism, which means that if you reach a lethality point where Salmonella bacteria die, most other pathogens should be taken care of as well. FSIS has stated that if you use scientific support that shows destruction of Salmonella, there's no need to find additional support for destruction of the other pathogens. Note that the Clostridial species is only a concern if fermentation and/or water activity and pH are not achieved before cooling. And if any Salmonella, S-tex, or Listeria monocytogenes are found on RTE product, the product is considered adulterated under the Federal Meat Inspection Act or the Poultry Products Inspection Act, whichever is applicable. And as always, remember to conduct your own hazard analysis at your facility. These hazards on the screen are common biological hazards, but this is not an all exhaustive list. Okay, so if you use the 2021 Appendix A, you must reach a 5 log reduction in Salmonella in both meat and poultry products for jerky, since it is a shelf-stable product. The critical parameters are come-up time, relative humidity, and endpoint time and temperature. For come-up time, the total time that product is between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 130 degrees Fahrenheit is 6 hours or less. Most jerky cycles are less than 6 hours to begin with, so this typically is not an issue. And if your jerky cycle is longer than that, it may be time to look at a different smokehouse schedule. Okay, critical parameter 2 is ensuring that products reach a time and temperature combination within Appendix A. This slide shows the first part of the chart for meat products, and we recommend that processors utilize the 7 log reduction lethality column at the far right to support their process. Again, note this chart and the chart in the following slide are for meat products only. The second part of the meat products chart is for option 1 and 2 of the humidity requirements we will discuss here shortly. And that's only if the endpoint temperature is greater than 145 degrees. And again, just remember this chart is for meat products only. Okay, I understand this chart here is a little hard to read. It is small, but it is in the Appendix A compliance guideline. And the table on this slide is specific for chicken products only. So if you would like, pause your screen now to review. Otherwise, you will be able to review these within the compliance guideline. Okay. And the final time and temp combination is for turkey products. Please note when making turkey products, or making poultry products containing poultry species other than chicken or turkey, or products made with a mixture of poultry species, FSIS recommends selecting an endpoint temperature then using the longest dwell time recommended for the product fat content and endpoint temperature in either the chicken or the turkey tables in the compliance guideline. So I hope that makes sense. If you're using a species other than chicken or turkey, you are able to use these temperatures, but you do want to go with worst case scenario, so the highest temperature you can for the longest dwell time. Okay, as for relative humidity, this is the critical parameter number 3 in Appendix A. A facility has 4 options to choose from if following these parameters. I would recommend pausing the video here to review these options. Note that option 1 and 2 on this slide may be used only if the endpoint temperature is greater than 145 degrees Fahrenheit. For thermal processes where the endpoint final temperature is less than 145 degrees Fahrenheit, you must use option 3 or 4 on this page. This flowchart was developed to aid processors in identifying which option to use for relative humidity. If you are working on identifying which option to use, go ahead and pause this slide to review it, to make sure to review this compliance guideline, make sure that you're following what you need to follow for your humidity requirements. Okay, so this slide here is just a reminder that smokehouse temperatures can be used in place of internal product temperature for meeting critical parameter number 2, which was lethality, as long as correlation studies have been completed and are maintained in plant. Additionally, the key question on this slide gives some more information on measuring endpoint temperature in products that are incredibly thin or where probing the product cannot be completed due to the physical characteristics of the product. Go ahead and pause the video now if you would like to review. As we have discussed, the 2021 Appendix A and B are not the end-all be-all for scientific support. There are other options that a processor can use as support for their process, and the 2014 Jerky Compliance Guideline published by USDA is one of these. If using the 2014 Jerky Compliance Guideline, the time and temp combinations from Appendix A will need to be met, as well as the relative humidity requirements. Additionally, if pH and/or water activity is used to support shelf stability, these limits must be met as well. And final reminder here, remember that moisture to protein ratio is not used as a shelf stability limit. Rather, moisture to protein ratio is used as a labeling guideline. So it's not a food safety parameter, it's more so to be in compliance with labeling. Okay, if you are using water activity for shelf stability, here are the limits. Again, this is in the 2014 Jerky Compliance Guideline. So for product that is packaged and exposed to oxygen, a water activity in the product needs to be 0.85 or less. If a product is packaged in a way that is not exposed to oxygen, like vacuum packaging or using oxygen scavengers, a water activity of 0.91 or less needs to be achieved. On this slide here, this is an example of a cook schedule that utilizes the 2014 Jerky Compliance Guideline parameters that are in combination with the 2021 Appendix A parameters. Note that relative humidity is at 27.8% of the cook time, which satisfies the limits in the Jerky Compliance Guideline. This slide here discusses some reminders for cooked products. Your smokehouses are going to have to be mapped for cold spots. Reach out to us, use your consultants or your supplier of your smokehouse if you need help completing this. In general, mapping your smokehouse is important for different types of products and especially important for small dimension products, such as jerky, where the temperatures inside your oven can directly impact the product temperature. The information must be kept on site as part of your validation. Make sure your probe placement is in a cold spot in your smokehouse for internal product temperature taking if a cold spot is present. If you use temperature monitoring equipment with a calibration range, your CCP must be on the high side of that calibration range. So the example is, if your CCP temperature is 158 degrees Fahrenheit and the equipment you are monitoring the temperature with has a calibration range of plus or minus 2 degrees, your operational limit temperature needs to be at least 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so if your facility cannot meet any of the critical limits identified in Appendix A, these are other options. One option is the use of scientific studies, one is the use of predictive microbial monitoring, and one is the use of challenge studies. Note the first two listed here are the cheaper, less time-intensive options. Now we are going to dive into alternate support for jerky processing. By utilizing the paper referenced on this slide, the smokehouse schedule for option 1A in this paper is displayed here. If you're going to use this, the finished water activity would need to be 0.78 or less. I recommend pausing this slide to identify if this processing schedule would work for your facility. From the same paper as the slide previously, displayed here is yet another cook schedule. If you utilize a dry bulb at temperature at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, a water activity of 0.85 or less would need to be met. If you were to use a dry bulb of 190 degrees dry bulb temperature, then a final water activity of 0.89 or less would need to be met. Again, I recommend pausing this slide to identify if this cook process would work in your facility. This is yet another option for processing jerky, utilizing the same scientific support as the previous two slides. You'll need to have a finished water activity of about 0.86 or less to utilize this option. Please pause this screen to review. Another additional option from the same paper for a supportable processing schedule and product will need to have a finished water activity of 0.87 or less. Again, pause the screen to review to identify if this processing schedule will work for your facility. The last supportable option from the scientific study is displayed here. Final product would need to have a finished water activity of 0.89 or less. Please pause the screen to review. Note this is the last supportable option in this study that meets the pathogen reduction required by FSIS regulation. Okay, we are moving on to a different paper, and this is for ground and formed jerky products. This slide demonstrates the cook schedule needed to utilize option 2A and 2B in the study, which the only difference between the two is the application of smoke. So a finished water activity of 0.68 would need to be achieved if not using smoke, and a finished water activity of 0.78 would need to be achieved if adding smoke. So please pause the slide to review this option. Same scientific study as the previous slide, this gives a different supportable cook cycle with finished water activities of 0.69 or less than or equal to 0.90, where no smoke was added with the 0.69 or less, and smoke was added with the 0.90 or less water activity. Again, an additional support cook cycle from the same scientific study. This is again is for ground and formed jerky. This is with a final water activity of 0.83 or less with no smoke added, or 0.87 or less with smoke added during the cook cycle. Remember that smoke addition does have some antimicrobial effects. This is the final supportable cook cycle, but note that it has the lowest level of lethality within the paper. You will meet the scientific support if you have a finished water activity of 0.74 or less with no smoke added, or 0.90 or less with smoke added during the cook cycle. This is the last slide for the second alternative scientific study we have discussed. We will now move on to support for poultry jerky. So for support with poultry jerky, with the scientific support option listed on this slide, the critical limits for poultry jerky would be an oven temperature of 180 degrees Fahrenheit for 2.5 hours, a relative humidity of 29.9% during the cooking and drying steps, and a marinade with a pH of around 5.5. So if processors would like to look at a different option than producing shelf-stable jerky, processors could use the Appendix A and B guidelines to produce ready-to-eat dried product that is not shelf-stable. This may be favorable for very small plants that do not produce a lot of ready-to-eat product. This saves the processor from having to meet and prove the standard of identity for jerky, as well as meet the shelf stability parameters. Finally, this slide is a duplication of the slide from the previous video. This is identifying how to conduct research appropriately to be able to find specifically what you're looking for if you are going to be doing your own scientific support and your own research. Okay, and on this slide, this is just a final reminder and some resources on how to conduct research, what sites to go to, and what to do if you have trouble accessing the papers. At this point, this concludes the second video, our jerky alternate support parameters for cooking and cooling. Please stay tuned for our video number 3, which will be focusing on fermentation products.